Hi everyone. It's been a couple of weeks since I got back from my latest habitat adventure. I know always that time has been filled with looking back on everything that made it such an amazing experience. The work that we accomplished, the lives that we touched, the camaraderie of the team, old friendships renewed and new friendships begun, laughter shared and many lessons learned. It's not possible to distill all of that into a 20-minute talk, um, but I'm going to try and share the essence of the lessons I learned on this build. I think there's some importance in sharing those lessons with a wider audience, so here goes. As you know, I volunteer with both the YWCA and Habitat for Humanity, so I think a lot about home and housing and shelter. If you look up the definition of home in the dictionary, it gives you rather cold, logical answers. Things like the place where one lives permanently or a place for human habitation. And at its most fundamental, I suppose that's true. Home is a place. At that level, it's one of the most basic of human needs, a place of shelter. Along with the other physiological needs like air, food, water, and so on, these are the things we need to address before we can address any more complex needs. But a shelter is a house or a building, not necessarily a home. And it's the concept of home that I wanted to ponder just a little bit today. Much of this comes from my recent habitat build at Curve Lake First Nation, but it also comes from my work with the YWCA, and some of it comes from past experiences building homes for people in need far away. And to be honest, some of it comes from my recent family history of selling my parents' house after it had been their home for more than 50 years. As I said, the dictionary gives a rather cold definition of home, but if you ask people to define home, you get a much different vibe. The old platitude, home is where the heart is, or home is where you feel loved, appreciated, and safe. There's an Irish proverb that says, bricks and mortar make a house, but the laughter of children makes a home. Or as Dorothy said simply, there's no place like home. One of my colleagues said it this way, for me, home is not a place to live in. It's the feeling I have when loving, caring people are around me. I can link the place to a good memory, but without people, it's an inanimate object. For me, one of the best things about going far away is coming home afterwards. Especially if the place you've traveled to knows hardship and darkness, nothing is better than coming home. It makes you appreciate your own home that much more, wherever and whoever home is for you. And I think that's especially true when you travel somewhere specifically to build homes for people in need. I had the honor of doing my first build in the Philippines in an area that had been devastated by Typhoon Haiyan. We worked on a complex of typhoon-resistant homes where the families could live in relative safety. When we were there, we talked to some of the neighborhood school kids who described how they cried and prayed as the typhoon raged around their meager homes. I'm sure it's no less scary during the typhoons now, but at least the homes they occupy offer greater safety for the families. And safety is great. But it was the photos I saw the year after we were there, when children were playing in the streets of the complex. That's what made that complex a home. The backstory behind my second build overseas never fails to make me angry. We were building a home in what I refer to as a slum outside of Delhi, India. Officially, in the government's eyes, it's a relocation community. In the build-up to the Commonwealth Games a number of years ago, the Indian government didn't want the people coming in for the games to see their slums, so they forced the people out and moved them to these relocation communities outside of the city. Their homes were undoubtedly not much before they were kicked out, but they were their homes, where they had a community and social structure. To be unceremoniously shoved out of your home and dumped somewhere else is kind of unbelievable. Looking back, it's one of the things that made me so happy to be able to help build a home there. Not just a house, but a home for that family. My third build overseas, as most of you know, was in rural Nepal. We worked on a home for a small family where the woman was paralyzed from the waist down. I can show you pictures later of the hut they were living in when we got there. You have no idea how much I like knowing that the home we built for them would help keep them sheltered during the monsoon rains. In fact, some months after we were there, we saw photos on the news of the airport in NIagara flooded in the rains. We had used that airport to get into the area during the build. There was a picture of an airplane there stranded, unable to get out because the water was up to the top of the wheels. but we knew that the family we built for would have been safe and protected in the home we helped build them. What a privilege to have been able to do that. Those 3 build experiences simply reinforced what I've always experienced in my own life prior. A home is more than just a house. It's family and love, a place to teach and a place to learn. It's the knowledge that there's at least one place where you belong and where you will always belong. For 2018, I decided not to travel overseas. Instead, I wanted to do a build here in Canada in honor of my dad. He was always tremendously proud to call Canada his home, and I'm no less proud of that. So I accepted an invitation to join a team that was working on a home at Curve Lake First Nation, about an hour north of Peterborough. And what an eye-opener that trip turned out to be. This is where my message starts to take an unexpected turn, because some of the things I learned about this country that I call home were very hard to hear. But the fact that they're hard to hear and hard to accept doesn't make it any less important to discuss them. In fact, I think it makes it more important. So let's get to it. The whole concept of truth and reconciliation with the Indigenous peoples of Canada has had a lot of publicity over the last few years. But to be perfectly honest, for me, it all seemed kind of vague and nebulous up until recently. We've all driven through reserves and seen the often ramshackle housing and wondered why the people there don't take care of their houses. And I've heard the point of view articulated, why can't they just learn to be like us? And I know people whose greatest contact with Indigenous culture is when they head out to the reserve for cheap gas and cheap tobacco. My perspective started to change last year when I was involved in a Truth and Reconciliation conference. I was just there helping out by live streaming the proceedings, but because I was there listening, some of the things that were said started to soak in. Then after I was accepted for the Curve Lake build, some interesting study materials were sent to the team to help us prepare. And then when we were in Curve Lake, we spent a considerable amount of time with their cultural historian, and we learned a great deal about treaties that I at least had never known before. And we took a side trip to Petroglyphs Provincial Park, which takes on a whole new significance when you look at it after you've been exposed to Indigenous culture just a little bit, and you have some idea what the teaching rocks actually mean. What I learned, and where I'm going with all this, and the reason it's a big part of a message titled Home, is that the Indigenous attitude is, in many ways, way more mature than ours is. Home for them is not a place or a structure, but it's the land and all it contains. Remember earlier I said home was a place to teach and a place to learn. Well, the Indigenous point of view toward the land includes both of those things, and everything else they need. It is truly home for them. When you study the history of European contact with the Indigenous communities here in the Americas, or what they called Turtle Island, you begin to see how much differently it could have all played out. It's kind of despicable how little I knew of the history of our early contact, how we came here to settle, and ended up stealing and raping the very land that welcomed us with so much potential. And in so doing so, we destroyed thousands of years of symbiotic relationship between our Indigenous brethren and their home, this land. Part of the preparatory reading for our build in Curve Lake was a book called Whose Land Is It Anyway? The preface was written by Bev Sellers, who had been chief of the Soda Creek First Nation in BC. I'm going to read part of that preface verbatim, since it speaks eloquently from a pure Indigenous perspective. Here's what she wrote. I often imagine what might have happened if the newcomers were respectful of the Indigenous peoples. I wonder what our lives would be if we learned from each other and took the best of our cultures for everyone. We freely and generously shared our knowledge of the land to help the newcomers adapt to their new life. They would have died without our help, as many of them did. The population of the Americas was solid, secure, and strong at contact. Turtle Island was a world thousands of years old, where hundreds of cultures had thrived with their own governments and laws. But the arrogant thought of the newcomers was that this was a new world whose history began only when they arrived on its shores. Then as now, the Indigenous worldview is that the land is sacred. The newcomers could have learned the importance of taking care of Mother Earth and allowing her to continue to provide the tremendous bounty she has to offer. Indigenous teachings tell us that the land and waters provide us with everything we need to survive. The newcomers had a different view. The land to them was to be conquered and exploited. So over time, Mother Earth's bounty is being destroyed by a foreign economy based on monetary profit. It is only recently that these teachings about Mother Earth have gotten through to a few newcomers. Global warming, polluted waters, and atrocious environmental standards are finally being recognized for what they are. The indigenous peoples of this country knew and practiced the intelligent way of living sustainably thousands of years before the newcomers arrived. Imagine how much healthier our environment would be if this way of living was respected instead of being viewed as a pagan practice. If you go back to my earlier quotation, why don't they just learn to be like us? After my experience at Curve Lake, what I want to know is why don't we just learn to be more like them instead and treat this land, our home, with the respect it deserves? You may have noticed recently that many public events start out now by recognizing whose territory the event is taking place on, acknowledging the indigenous peoples for whom it is home. At Curve Lake, we started the build with this proclamation. We respectfully acknowledge that this build site is located on the Treaty 20 Mississauga territory and in the traditional territory of the Mississauga and Chippewa nations, collectively known as the Williams Treaties First Nations, which include Curve Lake, Hiawatha, Alderville, Scugog Island, Rama, Beausoleil, and Georgina Island First Nations. Habitat for Humanity, Peterborough and Kawartha Region respectfully acknowledges that the Williams Treaties First Nations are the stewards and caretakers of these lands and waters in perpetuity, and that they continue to maintain this responsibility to ensure their health and integrity for generations to come. I'm sure you've heard similar statements at other events locally. I know that the YWCA in Niagara has made a commitment to opening events that way. But I've heard and read some thoroughly hateful and contemptuous comments about starting events with these acknowledgments. It comes back to the whole, why can't they just learn to be like us sort of mentality. I think it's clear where I stand on that. But just in case we weren't already clear, let me say it a different way. Our faith says that this world was created for us as our home. We need to learn to care for our home. And the indigenous ways could teach us so much of what we so clearly need to learn. Their spiritual connection to their Creator and this land, their home, is to be envied, not held in contempt. I'll give you a small example of how they celebrate that connection. At the beginning of several events and learning opportunities, we started with a smudge, which is an indigenous tradition to recognize and honor why we're here. There's 4 sacred medicines that can be used to smudge: tobacco, sage, sweetgrass, and cedar. The smudges that we participated in use sage, which is used to cleanse our energy and our senses so that we can touch things gently, think clearly, see things clearly, hear the goodness in all things, speak with kindness and without judgment, and cleanse our steps so we walk lightly on our mother the earth. When you experience a little bit of that indigenous spirituality, you begin to see why the whole residential school debacle was so hurtful to their families and their communities. Take the children out of the context of those strong spiritual traditions and force them to be like us, and it's no wonder they suffer so badly from social problems and substance abuse and suicide. I challenge you to picture for a moment your own children being snatched away from home and family and sent away to a place of foreign language and foreign attitudes, where they're forbidden the spiritual practices that connect them to their home. How would you expect them to come out of that undamaged? I don't see how it's possible, even for a moment, for one breath, to question why truth and reconciliation is a necessary part of our Canada, now and into the future. And of course, it's more than just the residential school story that we should be lamenting. Much of the history of our interaction with Indigenous communities here on Turtle Island is rife with lies and mistreatment and broken promises. I would encourage you to read the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and consider how many ways we, as the treaty peoples of Canada, have fallen short of those ideals. Think back to the beginning of this talk and the definitions of home that have been mentioned. Did any of those imply that a home was something to be destroyed with casual contempt? That's exactly what we're doing to our home here on earth. I don't care by what name you know God, or how you choose to worship him or her. My point is this. Don't you think God weeps to see the spoiling of our home, this earth, this home created for us? It's time to let go of the greed that's destroying us and every other living thing on this planet. This is our home, ours to cherish and share. Let's start to take care of it and take care of each other. Let's make our home here on this little blue planet a place of shelter and safety and growth and learning and love. Home.